Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with Mitch J and George Ortega. And Mitch has some taboo topics for us today, some ideas that humans don't accept very well. So perhaps Mitch would like to go through this list with us.
Yes, indeed. So, what should always come first is rationality. It should be logic, it should be reason, and we shouldn't be held hostage by fear. I think we can all agree upon that. Usually on this show, we're talking more directly about free will, because that's the name of the podcast. And it's certainly our goal to society by revealing the truth of this determined verse of it and help people reform, for example, the criminal justice system with this knowledge that free will is bogus. However, there are other major taboos that prevent scientific progress and oftentimes or human advancement or social progress in general. And the opposition, once again, just like the opposition that we get from free will believers when we talk about free will, they make these these naive sort of comments that are obviously based out of fear. So some other ones that I've identified that are holding us back, that are holding the transhumanist movement, as it's sometimes called, include the following. So here's a short list. So when it comes to religion, religious believers will say, how can we have morality without religion? When it comes to free will, as I noted earlier, believers in free will say, how can we have a successful criminal justice system without free will? Or how can we hold people accountable if no one's truly responsible for anything? How can we have more responsibility? When it comes to pain and suffering, people think that we can't have a sophisticated sense of touch without feeling pain, that we need to be able to feel pain in order to operate in this world. And lastly, science in general. There's this fear of science, this idea that we'll lose our humanity and become mechanical automatons if we just invest in nanotechnology and we augment our intelligence. That part of being human is about making mistakes. But of course, these ideas, although I understand where these fears stem from, I think we all do. When you really, really analyze it, when you get down to it and you analyze the minutia behind it, you realize these are really untenable, arguments. These are really weak. Why should we allow pain and suffering when we can get rid of it? George, you in particular, you often note about this. I think the last part was cut out of the broadcast here. I just wanted to pose the question to you, George. How can, if we really analyze what does it mean when someone says we should feel pain? What does that mean?
Okay,
To what extent, if any, should we feel pain?
I personally believe we shouldn't feel any pain at all. That pain is simply an unnecessary and, just basically a mistaken product of our evolution. That our neurobiology doesn't require it, our survival doesn't require it. So, my opinion is that people champion pain, they defend pain because they feel there's no way to overcome it. So, like, it's like a sour grapes attitude. If we can't succeed at overcoming pain, we don't want to. That's my opinion about how other people feel about it.
So, Chandler, do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree because here's something that I think we all want to eliminate pain. We seek pleasure and avoid pain. And I'm a little bit surprised by this attitude of some people who claim that we have to have pain and that it somehow makes us human. And I'm like, well, I don't want to be feeling pain. If I could transform myself into some new species that doesn't feel pain, I would. And those other people, if they want to feel pain, that's their problem.
Certainly, I think another issue is that most people, they just aren't imaginative enough. They don't realize how much pain others are feeling. And I think this is really tied to the just world fallacy. That is, many people believe that somehow people who are tortured, for example, people who are going through tremendous physical torture, somehow deserve what they got. The person who understands that free will is an illusion, he or she is more empathetic and realizes, not just empathetic, but realizes, wow, I could be that person. I could be the person underground in some basement somewhere having my skin flayed. I could be the person in some internment camp somewhere being tortured. Like having my
But
nails bitten
Mitch,
off
it's
like that.
beyond that. It's like, for example, we don't have to say that it could be us. I mean, we have enough empathy for other people that that other people's pain, that for their sake, without even including us, we don't want those things to happen. You're completely right. To tie this, to the free will theme a bit, compatibilists, they accept and understand that nobody could have chosen otherwise, but because, as you were saying before, they feel that everything equals out in the end, that basically, like, people aren't really as unfortunate as they seem, because, like, things balance out. That's such a nonsense belief. They think that that justifies, therefore, our punishing people, with this free will myth.
Well, yes, but I'm saying like one thing that I'm really concerned with is torture. Like I'm not necessarily against a small amount of pain. Suppose there was only a minor amount of pain in this world, like a pinch or a punch in the stomach is the most pain you would ever feel your entire life. I wouldn't necessarily, be passionately against eradicating that. But what I am certainly passionately against is the existence and possibility of torture. That anyone at any moment could be tortured. And like you said, George, this might have, I mean, not even might have, this is certainly a result of human evolution. And it was a very rudimentary way for biological beings to have this sense of touch. But certainly we don't no longer need it. In fact, many scientists have been looking into the issue of pain, eradicating pain, at least in humans and possibly eventually in all sentient beings. And we can study the biological factors that contribute to physical pain. For example, David Pierce, long ago, he wrote about the hedonistic imperative, and he said that we could use biotechnology to abolish suffering. We could do that. So it's not as if we can't do that. It's that sometimes scientists, erroneously believe there's some moral objections to doing this. But what could be morally wrong about getting rid of pain and suffering when everything that is wrong is inextricably linked to pain and suffering? It's
I
just
agree.
illogical.
Yeah.
It's so illogical.
I agree. The whole point of having a system of morality or ethics is to reduce pain. So I don't see how there could be anything wrong with it.
I think the belief that we need pain is to a certain extent perpetuated by people who are very competitive, that to the extent that they're feeling less pain than others, they feel they're winning and all, that's their success. They could care less about, the suffering of other people. But, like, so it's not a valid rational argument. It's a self-serving argument by small, petty-minded, actually very cruel people. I mean, fine, we can't blame them. They don't have a free will, but it really is time to oppose them.
I I agree, but like I said, I think a lot of this is strongly linked to free will belief. If you, to a certain extent, don't truly believe that you could be tortured and that you controlled your life in some way you had some sort of influence, and that in some way you had some sort of input that is stopping you from being tortured, then that little sliver is really what is preventing you from trying to eliminate pain and suffering. Because that fear would be overwhelming if you knew you could be tortured. If you knew at any moment something absolutely horrible could happen to you, I don't see why you wouldn't try your best, your absolute best, to get rid of pain. But perhaps we can. I think we exhausted that one a little bit. So how about religion? We've mentioned this a couple times. Maybe Chandler, you'd like to give your thoughts first on this one. So this is a really old defense that people still use, even though it's been shattered to pieces since the history of humankind. How can we have morals without religion?
I've heard this all my life and I'm really, really confused about it. And for one thing, the reason why I came to see it as absurd years ago is that you have different religions teaching different moral codes that are in conflict. And so I believe that you more need to get rid of harmful religions if you're gonna have morality. So in order to have morality, you have to not have religion in a sense that way. Unless it's, a completely benign religion, but how many of those besides Jainism are there?
All right, I'm
Yeah,
gonna like I agree with you guys that we don't require religion or the belief in God for morality, but I have to also basically bring into this that if we get rid of, to the extent that we get rid of religion or attack it in this sense, we have to replace it with an institution that teaches morality. Because we don't really learn morality in the educational system. We don't learn it through the criminal justice system, except in the case of like, well, if you do something wrong, you get punished. It's not like they try to explain to you why something is wrong and all. So again,
that's a
why?
good point. So maybe we need more education in philosophy. That's what we're saying, because philosophy is the area usually where you study morality, you study ethics and morals in philosophy. And philosophy in our society, especially in Western society, especially in the United States, it's seen as something that is not very important, and that people who are inclined and have a fondness for it might take it on themselves in college to investigate philosophy. So I agree, Jordan. Maybe this is the real issue. The real issue is that people aren't being taught how to logically, scientifically figure out how humans should behave. And so, because that isn't emphasized in society, they just turn to religion because it's a lazy way to do it. It's the lazy way. It's the way that
Exactly.
doesn't require thinking.
What I would suggest is like philosophy can be an extremely narrow, I mean, a wide field. For example, like what is the essence of knowledge? How do we know what we know and all? So, like, while philosophy is good, I think it's more kind of like what we need is a practical education. For example, we have a 50% divorce rate. People don't know how to talk to each other. People don't know how to resolve differences. The average level of happiness here in the United States is only 70%. It could be much higher. People don't know how to be happy. People don't know how to be good. It's like people think that they're doing the right thing, like these compatibilists and stuff, when they're not. So, like, kind of like a practical education, philosophy based, of course, um, on how to be good and how to be happy. We absolutely, the world would be completely transformed if our educational systems devoted even, for example, like 1 hour a day to this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely side of Chandler. I think when you really investigate morality without any kind of wishful thinking, without any kind of dogmatic influences, you realize it actually becomes difficult to have morality when religion's in the way. Because I mean, what is more moral to say that it's wrong to kill because you don't want someone to feel pain, or because there's a practical reason to not kill, or to say it's wrong to kill because some guy said so, just to make an argument from authority.
Right,
Because
but
the
you got to
magic,
understand, like, even though I think, Mitch, I agree with you, most of our religions are, prophecy based and all. For example, like Buddhism, like the Tibetan Buddhist religion, discipline, they are very analytical. They don't just like accept what the Buddha said, they kind of like explore it. So it's not religion per se, I think, that is harmful to morality. It's, as you're saying, this authority based, that like, pleasing God is what's good, or doing what this guy a few thousand years ago said is good is good. So we have to shift
well,
from
to be
that.
clear, to be very clear, I am contesting the claim that some people make naively, that you can't have morality without religion. That's all I'm addressing.
Oh yeah, no,
So
I agree
I'm saying
completely. I agree completely. Yeah.
actually, that's uh, religion, morality, just religion. A particular religion might preach a certain kind of morality, but that's not where morality should come from in the first place. Morality should just be about rigorous reasoning, trying to figure out why we should behave a certain way.
But
And
again, you
if
got
some
you
religion matches that, then perhaps it does. But if it doesn't, then it doesn't.
Right, you got to understand religion, the way it developed. Think about it like before we had civilization. Religion was one of our first institutions. Basically, it was like an attempt to figure out what was going on. What's the nature of this reality? They didn't have science. They didn't have like the philosophical tradition. So it was just then, like, unfortunately, instead of relying on religion, on reason, they relied on the authority of these wise people, these sages, these prophets. So again, it's not religion per se that is so harmful. It's just the way that it has evolved. And just like, for example, with our civilization, we went from the feudalism, which was like very, barbaric, to now like a capitalism that is still barbaric. I mean, just like we don't throw out civilization because because it's not as good as it should be. I'm not sure we should, think about kind of like, doing away with the religion when some parts of religion are extremely beneficial to society.
Well, I strongly disagree with that idea. But regardless, I do agree with you on the idea that definitely part of the history of religion was an attempt to answer questions that people couldn't answer, and they didn't have the same scientific discoveries that they had nowadays. But okay, so what about the last topic? Let's get to this one of the four. So we've talked about when it comes to free will, people say, oh, well, actually, yeah, when it comes to free will, the objection is, how can we have a successful criminal justice system without free will? How can we solve problems if we never hold anyone accountable? So I guess there's two more. I guess we didn't really address that. There's that issue, and then I want to talk about there's the fear of science. Um, yeah, so let's start there, I guess.
Chandler, why don't you weigh in? Explain how like free will is just belief in free will is simply not necessary to a criminal justice system.
Sure. For one thing, the very idea of a criminal justice system, and I really don't even like the word justice because it seems to be tied in with retribution and free will belief. But I'm pretty sure that the purpose of any type of laws and reward and punishments would be behavior modification, which depends on causality and that people can be changed by these rewards or punishments. So it's very anti free will. So it's like to have a criminal justice system, you need to give up belief in free will and do what actually works and get to the psychology of it.
Very well said. That's a very good point. So, Chandler, walk us through it. Let's say I think some skeptics, when some believers in free will, I should say, they would they would bring forth this argument. They would say, okay, we don't have, it's not reasonable for us to analyze the individual the causes that affect each individual. So for practical purposes, we need to have these general sweeping laws. For example, let's say a 14-year-old steals some candy. We don't know anything else about that person, so it's a person who stole some candy. And now an 86-year-old woman stole some candy. We don't know anything about that person except that person stole some candy. And in our society, we have a population of, let's say, 300 million people. So the free will believer or just the pragmatist would say, well, okay, you guys say you can do this whole thing, but how exactly would your criminal justice system work? What do you do now? What do you do now after the person has stolen the candy? You know, and they're resisting arrest. What are you going to do to that person? So how would you answer that argument, Chandler?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert in how this would work, but I can come up with something, I'm sure. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think that it's unreasonable to have some type of penalty for, and they in fact do have just like we have now, where there will be a fine or jail for stealing. That could still be done because in some cases that will deter people, but other times if they're a kleptomaniac or something, then it won't. But in either case, for the practical purposes of stopping people from stealing the candy, then you could still have a system of law and punishments if that's what you want. But I have no horse in the race of exactly how they do it.
Well, my point is right. So, as free will skeptics, we would say, well, we want to know the reason why the person stole the candy, right? And then we would treat them accordingly. But the pragmatist, the free will believer, the pragmatist, the compatibilist, goes, well, sorry, you can't really do that. And then they'll go on to make this argument. They'll extend the argument fallaciously that, so since you can't do it in this situation, you can never do it. Now, I mean,
Well,
Yes, go ahead,
Why? I
George.
mean, I mean, it is a fallacious argument. Of course, you can do it. We can do it. We do it all the time. Because like, for example, like, we don't. In other words, like, we impose like laws and rules, not really because people have a free will, but actually because people don't have a free will. Because, in other words, since we don't have a free will, we are programmed, hardwired to respond well to reward and punishment. That's part of our basic biological makeup. And so, yes, so like, so our part of our criminal justice system is based on like this reward and punishment. Well, unfortunately, it's too much based on the punishment part. So that remains. So, but what we get rid of, what no longer makes sense is like, for example, like they did a survey where they primed half of this group to believe in free will, the other half to not believe in free will, and they were asked to weigh in on how much of a sentence like a theoretical person who committed a crime should receive, and the free will believers um, had double the penalty for this crime as the other. So that's what we need to get rid of.
Yes, indeed. So even if it's difficult for us to work out the exact terms, exactly how we should treat people, even though it might be burdensome, that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And like you've alluded to in the past, George, there are other systems in our society where we make that effort. So when it comes to the mentally ill, we don't say, "Oh, it's impractical, so we should burn the mentally ill alive." When it comes to children, we don't say, "Oh, it's impractical, so they need to get the death penalty." So yeah, it's definitely a fallacious argument, and what really happens, as I've argued in the past, is that human beings want to split the world into black and white, into heroes and villains, and at some point our empathy runs out. At some point, we just aren't empathetic anymore. So moving on. Here's the last topic I wanted to bring about. So it's about science this time. So our taboo so far has been free will, and the naive question against free will is from the opposition is, how can we hold people accountable? How can we have a successful criminal justice system? Now we just addressed that, and in addition to the comments we made, there are some people such as Greg Caruso. Interested listeners can look up the Justice Without Retribution network. He, along with one of the original hardened compatibilists of the modern era, Dirk Pereboom, and many others, are working to explain precisely how we can have this new, compassionate, logical kind of justice system. Anyway, so yeah, so when it comes to free will, the opposition naively says, how can we have a successful criminal justice system? How can we hold people accountable? Where's the moral responsibility? When it comes to religion, how can we have morals without religion? When it comes to pain and suffering, won't we lose our humanity if we don't feel pain? How can we have a sophisticated sense of touch if we don't feel pain? Okay, so I think we've addressed those so far. But the last one that remains, I think, is the fear of science in general. So, is there a point where we should stop using science to improve ourselves? Some people are fearful of GMOs or this idea of an augmented humanity. In other words, using like technology to improve our memory, um, nanotechnology, cloning, for example, in order to farm organs, for example. And they're fearful this will lead to the erosion or destruction of humanity.
Well, this I think that's a very bizarre fear because now I can sort of see their point because sure, because people do harmful things and because they do make mistakes, and yeah, there's some immoral things that can be done with science, but I still think it's better to embrace science and keep using science for solutions to problems rather than just to throw out science and go back to religion or something crazy like that.
Right. So I think one example people use is they use the atom bomb. They go, what if science keeps making bigger and bigger bombs? But the real issue isn't the science, right? It's the intent, It's
Yeah.
guns don't kill people, people kill people. You know what I mean? If everyone is trying to be rational and logical, if everyone is moral and compassionate, then we don't really have to worry any longer about what science is capable of. We have to worry about changing the attitudes of people. As long as people have the right intentions, then science isn't really a threat, is it?
No, it's not. That it's really free will belief that's the threat.
And why is free will belief so threatening?
Basically because it leads us to, like you said earlier, when people are tortured, when people are suffering greatly, people who believe in free will rationalize and say, well, it wouldn't happen unless those people deserve it because this world is fair and you get what you deserve. That's the kind of mentality, the kind of psychology that free will belief seems connected to.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, there's just so I guess one thing we've really identified is fear. Fear seems to be really the unifying figure in that's stopping the unifying obstruction that's just impeding the progress of human rights, of technology. It's really linked to all these ideas when it comes to religion, free will, pain and suffering, and in science. People fear people will become immoral, so they say, "How can we have morals without religion?"
I have another
People,
taboo
yeah.
idea
Oh, sure,
that I
please.
might just throw in real quick here. You may have come across this, Mitch, the argument, well, that if gay marriage becomes legal, well, then people will start raping their cats and dogs. It will lead to bestiality and it will lead to
Slippery
legal
slope.
legal child rape. I've heard that argument before. And so I think there's a type of weird slippery slope argument where people are I don't know if they're serious about these fears, like if they really believe that one thing will lead to some unrelated thing, or if they're just making this stuff up just as a poor argument because there's some hidden reason why they don't like something.
Um, I certainly, truly, sincerely believe that many people just haven't studied the foundations of logic, and they really don't know. They don't understand how to make a proper argument, how to construct it. What is solid reasoning? What's valid reasoning? And they don't understand that their reasoning is fallacious when they make these slippery slope arguments. That is to say, when someone makes the claim that if this will happen, then it will lead to this, which will lead to that, and then we'll have Nazis on dinosaurs. You know, that's the slippery slope argument. It's like saying there's a connection between things without demonstrating the modus ponens, without demonstrating this predicate logic. Um, so yeah, I think that's the real issue in that case.
Yeah, I because somebody has to demonstrate in some way, some argument for why a certain thing will lead to another thing. And I think that there aren't enough people. I mean, first of all, people are ignorant of causality. That's the only reason free will belief really persists, I think, is because people are unaware that some things cause other things, but some things are not caused by other things, but different causes instead of what they believed.
Interesting. Yeah.
Like, for example, Mitch, people believe that teaching children religious holy books instills in them beliefs about right or wrong and makes them moral people, but that's not where morality really comes from. And so it's about knowing the true cause of where things come from. Otherwise, we'll just be
Exactly.
confused.
Not just the cause, but it's unreliable. See, the beauty of logic and reason is that it's reliable. Y- this is the real key. You know, when so the religion might get it right, but it might get it wrong. And, that's the real issue. What if it gets it wrong? What happens when it gets it wrong? So for example, if every single if every single tenet of morality and that someone subscribes to because of their religion matches identically to secular scientific ideas, then you're in luck. But then it's not really religion, is it? But if it were that religion, that'd be fine. If it's just really the religion of science, and I'm not talking about Scientology, that'd be great. But that's not what religion is, right? Religious morality really seems to have three components. There's the bad stuff, the silly stuff, and the good stuff. So there might be something good, like the rule of reciprocity, otherwise known as the golden rule, doing to others as you would have them doing to you. But then for each of those rules, there'll be a silly rule, such as wear a funny hat, or don't cut your beard, or bend your or bow and pray to an invisible wall 5 times a day. And then there's the bad stuff. Homosexuality is an abomination. So when we try to get morals just from ideas, especially ideas that older anti-scientific people had, it's very unreliable. You
Yeah,
know?
and I have a really important point to make, Mitch. When somebody goes through their religious books and then they pick out the good elements. You'll notice that people do this. They'll pick out things like the golden rule, which I agree is pretty good. They'll pick out some good stuff, but then they'll ignore the silly stuff and they'll ignore some of the bad stuff. And I'm like, well, think about it. What standard are they using to decide which parts of their religion they follow and which they don't? And as soon as they find out what their standard is, then that's their morality and not the religion.
Yeah, it's pretty silly. So I guess we spent a lot of time on the moral one. Yeah, so the pain and suffering one, I think that's another one that holds people back. It really holds people back. People really think that we should feel pain. We should. It makes absolutely no sense,
It
but
only
they're
makes
just incapable of getting past this barrier.
well, it only makes sense if you're some kind of a sadist and you want to cause people pain.
Yes, but even the sadist is really just foolish. The sadist doesn't. If you tortured the sadist to a threshold beyond the sadist, um, uh, beyond a point the sadist can handle, then all of a sudden the sadist will beg for mercy too. So the sadist acts as if he wishes pain upon others, and the masochist acts as if he wishes pain upon himself. But there's really a limit to this as well. What he's really saying is, I want some measure of pain, or I enjoy the pleasure I get when I'm relieved from pain. That's what they don't realize. They're really saying, when I am relieved of pain, there is some kind of pleasure that I experience, and I feel like the only path to that pleasure is to go through the pain first. But they just don't have they haven't intellectually worked out the whole details of their sense of pleasure. In reality, it all breaks down to the same hedonic imperative. They're really just seeking pleasure as well, but they think the path to that pleasure might involve a certain amount of pain, that it's the only way to get there. If they believed there were another way, they would take the other way. That's what they're really saying.
Yeah. I don't think that we need pain to get pleasure. I don't know. I think what George said earlier was right, that it's a sour grapes attitude, Basically, they don't believe it's ever possible to remove pain, so they act like it's a good and necessary thing somehow.
Um, Great. So, are we done for this? We've been through all these topics, right? These major taboos from religion, free will, pain and suffering, and science, and we even did a little bit about the slippery slope. So we need people to be more open-minded, Chandler. And when people go through in-depth, rational investigations, they realize these weak defenses they come up with, these fears they have of morality and the criminal justice system and losing their humanity, they all vanish once we strive towards this futuristic, transhumanist, logical reality. It's really just about logic and compassion.
You're right, Mitch. And there's one more thing I want to say here is that first of all, even though it's true that we can still have our pleasure without pain, we can still have a criminal justice system without free will belief. There, and these things, nothing's really threatened by giving up free will belief. But even if it was, let's say that we are no longer human once we once we, give up free will belief. Let's say that morality or moral responsibility does break down. It's still true that we don't have free will, and I'm really sick of people trying to do, basically a fear of consequences fallacy. It's like, well, this is false because I don't like what I think the consequences are.
That's a, I think that's a very good way to close the show, Chandler. You're right. Uh, After all is said and done, we're trying to alleviate people of these fears, but you're right. The real issue is, you know what? That doesn't change the truth. It's this. You're right. It's another form of fallacious reasoning. Even if we did lose these elements, it still wouldn't change the truth. One of those truths, perhaps the most important one, is that free will is just an illusion, and all it is harmful for society.
Yeah. I mean, and one other thing. If part of being human is making mistakes and feeling pain, then I don't want to be human.
Exactly. What's so good about being human? If being human means to torture and murder, if being human means that we need to live in ignorance and that a large portion of people will suffer and another portion of people will cause the suffering until the end of time, why would you want to be that? Why don't we work to end that?
If that's what humanity is, then count me out.
Exactly.
All right, I guess it's time to close this one then, isn't it?
Yes, indeed.
All right, you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion, and we've talked about some transhumanistic ideas and tried to dispel some fears that people have over giving up free will belief or giving up pain or giving up religion, and how these fears are misplaced, but that truth is still important even if these were scary things. So I hope you've learned something from this episode. Thank you for listening and goodbye.